The heavy iron handle resisted at first, cold and unyielding under my grip. I leaned my weight against the wood, pushing until the hinges groaned in protest. The door swung inward, dragging across the uneven floorboards with a long, shuddering screech. Immediately, the air changed. The sharp, biting chill of the forest night vanished, replaced by a thick, dry warmth. I stepped over the threshold, my boots clicking against the stone floor. Ahead, the workshop opened up, bathed in the amber glow. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air, turning them into floating gold. I let the door swing shut behind me, the heavy latch clicking into place with a final, echoing thud. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust to the golden haze, waiting for the first sign of movement. I was inside. I moved deeper into the room, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of brass shavings scattered across the floor. The workbench dominated the space, a massive slab of oak scarred by decades of precise labor. There, framed by the golden halo of the lantern, stood Master Cogsworth. He did not turn as I approached, his attention locked on a microscopic adjustment to a brass housing. The lantern light caught the edges of his silver fur, turning the fine hairs into strands of glowing wire. He moved with a stillness that made the surrounding ticking seem loud. I stopped 3 paces away, watching the way his hands held the tools steady, rhythmic, and entirely focused. He was the center of this world, a figure carved from the same patience as the clocks he maintained. He finally shifted, his shoulders relaxing as he acknowledged my presence without breaking his concentration. Master Cogsworth turned slowly, his gaze meeting mine with a weight that demanded total attention. He swept his hand across the surface of the workbench, clearing away a light dusting of metal filings to create a clean, dark stage. His movements were deliberate, each gesture carrying the gravity of a man who measured life in seconds. He looked at me, his expression unreadable but expectant. "The time has come," he said. He stepped aside, revealing a space on the table where the lantern light hit the wood directly. "We must build the Grand Forest chronometer." He paused, letting the weight of the task settle between us. He leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the oak surface, and his eyes narrowed with intense focus. "This is not a simple repair. It is a work of legacy. It requires absolute precision." He tapped the wood twice, a sharp, rhythmic sound. Every gear must find its home. Every spring must hold its tension. There is no room for error here. He held my gaze, waiting for me to acknowledge. I nodded, and he turned back to the task, his posture signaling that the time for preparation had ended. He reached beneath the workbench and pulled out a heavy, rectangular box crafted from dark, polished walnut. He set it down between us with a soft thud that sent a fine cloud of dust dancing into the lantern light. With a flick of his wrist, he unlatched the lid. The interior was a labyrinth of compartments, each overflowing with a chaotic, shimmering wealth of mechanical parts. Hundreds of brass gears sat nestled against one another, their teeth interlocking in a jagged, metallic mosaic. Beside them, tiny springs coiled like dormant serpents. Golden screws were scattered in the corners, catching the light and winking back at me with sharp, precise edges. The sheer volume of the components was staggering. The brass surfaces hummed with a dull, golden luster, while the springs seemed to vibrate with stored potential. Every piece was unique. I leaned closer, the scent of machine oil and aged wood rising from the box. The complexity of the task suddenly felt tangible, a physical weight. Master Cogsworth watched me, his expression neutral, as I stared into the depths of the box, trying to comprehend the thousands of individual movements. I took a deep breath, the scent of brass and oil filling my lungs as I prepared to begin. My eyes scanned the labyrinth of compartments, searching for the specific tension spring Master Cogsworth had described. It was a tiny, delicate sliver of metal, barely visible among the larger gears. I reached out, my fingers hovering just inches above the smooth surface of the workbench. The light from the lantern cast long, flickering shadows across the table, making the task feel even more precarious. I extended my hand, aiming for the spring, but as my fingertips neared the metal, a sudden, sharp tremor ran through my paws. I pulled back, my muscles tightening against my will. The weight of the responsibility settled over me, turning the air thick and heavy. I tried to steady my grip, focusing all my attention on the singular goal, but the trembling persisted, a rhythmic vibration that made the delicate parts seem impossible to handle. I looked up at Master Cogsworth, hoping for a sign of encouragement, but his gaze remained fixed on the workbench, his silence amplifying my own uncertainty. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the steady ticking of the workshop clocks. I reached out again, slower this time. Fighting the involuntary shaking in my limbs, I pushed past the doubt, extending my hand once more toward the tiny coiled spring. My thumb and forefinger closed the distance, hovering over the brass. The metal was cold and impossibly small under the lantern light. Just as I applied the lightest pressure, the tremor in my palms spiked. My grip faltered. The spring did not just fall. It snapped away from my touch like a living thing. It struck the edge of the workbench with a sharp metallic ping that echoed against the stone walls of the workshop. I watched it arc through the air, a blur of silver, before it vanished into the deep, uneven pile of wood shavings scattered across the floor. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the ticking of the clocks. My stomach dropped. I stared at the spot where the spring had disappeared, my breath hitching in my throat. Panic surged, hot and sudden, flooding my chest. I scrambled to see the path it had taken, but the shavings were a chaotic sea of brown curls and dust. The realization hit me with the force of a blow. The component was gone, buried in the debris, and the delicate order of the project was shattered by my own clumsy hands. My heart raced, and the walls of the workshop seemed to press inward, closing off the light. I stood paralyzed. My muscles locked tight as if the air around me had turned to ice. The sound of the spring hitting the floor still rang in my ears, a sharp, accusing note that refused to fade. I did not move. I could not move. My gaze remained fixed on the spot where the metal had vanished. The silence of the workshop felt suffocating now, a heavy weight pressing down on my shoulders. I felt the heat rising in my face, a sharp sting of shame that burned brighter than the lantern light. Behind me, my tail betrayed my stillness. It lashed back and forth, a rhythmic, agitated twitching. Each flick of my tail was a frantic pulse, a physical manifestation of the panic I was trying to suppress. I was trapped in the mistake, unable to reach out, while the clocks continued their indifferent march forward. The air in the workshop felt thin, pulled tight by the weight of my error. My tail continued its frantic rhythm, a blur of motion against the stillness of the bench. I felt the floorboards shift behind me. A soft, measured tread approached, the sound of leather soles pressing into the wood. I did not turn. I could not pull my eyes away from the pile of shavings where the spring lay hidden. Then, the light shifted. A shadow fell across the workbench, blocking the glare of the lantern. Master Cogsworth moved into my periphery. He did not speak. He did not scold. Instead, he reached out with a steady, deliberate motion. His hand, weathered and sure, moved through the space between us. He did not grab or pull. He simply lowered his arm, his fingers finding my own. He placed his paw over mine, pressing down with a firm, unyielding weight. The contact was heavy and warm. It acted as a physical anchor, pinning my trembling hand against the hard surface of the workbench. The frantic lashing of my tail slowed, then ceased entirely. I was held, grounded, and the room stopped spinning. His paw remained a solid weight against mine, a constant pressure that demanded nothing but presence. He leaned in, his gaze steady, and signaled for me to follow his lead. We began the count. 1. I drew in a shallow breath, my chest tight and resistant. 2. He pressed down slightly, encouraging the expansion of my lungs. 3. The air filled my chest, pushing against the lingering knot of anxiety. 4. I held the breath, feeling the stillness of the room settle into my bones. Then, we exhaled together. A long, slow release that carried the heat of my panic away. The sound of our breathing became a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the ticking of the clocks. Again. 1. The air felt cleaner, cooler as it passed through my nose. 2. My shoulders, hunched toward my ears, began to drop. 3. The tremor in my fingers faded, replaced by the steady, grounding warmth of his touch. 4. I let the air out, feeling the last of the frantic energy dissipate. My frame, once rigid and brittle, softened under his guidance. The sharp edges of my frustration smoothed out, leaving behind a quiet, receptive clarity. I was no longer fighting the mistake. I was simply waiting for the next movement. The room felt larger now, the light less blinding, and the path forward finally clear. The panic had receded, leaving behind a quiet, hollow space where my focus now resided. I turned my attention to the workbench. The pile of wood shavings lay scattered like a miniature forest, golden and curled, hiding the tiny, vital piece I had lost. I did not rush. I remembered the weight of his paw and the rhythm of our breath. I extended my hand, my fingers hovering for a moment. I began to sift through the shavings, moving with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. Every fiber of wood felt distinct under my touch. I pushed the shavings aside in small, measured increments, clearing a path through the debris. The light from the lantern caught the edge of a brass fragment. I kept moving. I did not let my heart race when I came up empty-handed. I sifted again, deeper this time, feeling the grain of the wood. My movements were fluid, stripped of all unnecessary tension. I felt the resistance of the shavings, the way they clung to my fur, but I remained steady. Then, my fingertip brushed against something cool and metallic. I paused, holding my breath, and gently cleared the last layer. There it was. I held the spring between my thumb and forefinger, feeling its tension, a tiny coil of potential energy. It was smaller than I remembered, fragile and demanding. I lifted it toward the housing, my hand steady. I did not force the movement. I allowed the metal to find its own path, guiding it with the tip of a needle-nose tool. The workshop seemed to hold its breath with me. I watched the housing, the brass edges gleaming, waiting for the perfect angle. My muscles remained loose, my breathing shallow and rhythmic. I felt the resistance of the housing, a tiny friction. I pushed, just a fraction of a millimeter, feeling the spring slide into the groove. It sat flush. Click. The sound was sharp, clear, and absolute. It was a small, singular victory that resonated through the workbench. I looked at Master Cogsworth, who offered a slow, approving nod. The first hurdle was cleared. With the spring secured, the next phase of the assembly lay before us. I reached for the primary gear, a heavy brass disc with teeth cut to microscopic tolerances. Master Cogsworth held the housing steady, his gaze fixed on the alignment point. I lowered the gear into the center of the frame, feeling the weight of it settle against the pivot. It did not slide in immediately. I had to rotate it, feeling for the exact moment the teeth caught the internal drive. I nudged the gear clockwise, then counterclockwise, searching for the seat. The metal felt cold and unforgiving against my pads. I applied a steady, even pressure, pushing the gear down until it sat flush against the escapement. I withdrew my hands, leaving the mechanism to hold its own weight. Master Cogsworth tapped the balance wheel with a thin rod. The gear shivered. It hesitated for a heartbeat, then lurched forward. A faint, rhythmic sound began to emanate from the housing, a soft, metallic pulse that grew with every rotation. The first gear was turning. It was a slow, deliberate motion, the teeth clicking against one another with the precision of a heartbeat. The workshop seemed to vibrate in sympathy with the sound. I watched the brass surface catch the golden light, spinning in a perfect, continuous loop. The silence of the room was broken, replaced by the steady, mechanical respiration of the machine. It had begun. The rhythm of the first gear was merely the beginning. Now, the true complexity of the Grand Forest chronometer revealed itself. We moved deeper into the housing, where the layers of brass and steel grew dense and unforgiving. Master Cogsworth laid out a series of secondary plates, each riddled with holes no larger than a grain of sand. I picked up a pair of tweezers, my focus narrowing until the rest of the workshop blurred into shadow. We had to thread 3 separate drive shafts through the plates simultaneously, a task that demanded total synchronization. My fingers ached from the stillness required to hold the plates in place. Every movement had to be calculated. I watched the shafts slide into their respective housings, feeling the microscopic friction as they passed through the bearings. Every piece we added increased the weight of the mechanism, making the assembly more stable, yet more difficult to maneuver. The core of the chronometer demanded more than just precision. It demanded a stillness I had yet to fully master. We reached for a small, serrated cog meant to bridge the gap between the main drive and the secondary escapement. I placed it onto the central spindle, but it refused to seat. The teeth ground against the housing with a harsh, grating sound. I tried to nudge it into place, but the cog slipped, tilting at an awkward angle that blocked the entire assembly. My pulse quickened. The urge to force the metal into submission flared, a sharp, hot impulse in my chest. I forced myself to stop. I let go of the tweezers and pulled my hands back, pressing my palms flat against the workbench. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs and then leave in a controlled, steady stream. I reached back into the housing, my movements now measured and calm, and began the alignment process once more. I leaned in, my breath held tight in my chest as I guided the stubborn cog toward the spindle. The metal teeth were nearly flush, a perfect fit only a hair's breadth away. My focus was absolute, but my muscles were coiled too tight. A sudden, involuntary tremor rippled through my right arm. My elbow clipped the edge of the brass tray resting near the assembly. The tray tipped. It did not slide. It flipped. Hundreds of tiny, golden screws spilled across the workbench in a chaotic spray. They bounced off the wood, hit the floor, and scattered into the dark corners of the workshop. The sound was deafening. It was a sharp, metallic clatter that echoed against the stone walls, shattering the silence we had worked so hard to maintain. Each strike of metal against the floor felt like a hammer blow to my progress. The screws rolled into the shadows, disappearing beneath the heavy workbench. I stood frozen, my hands still hovering over the half-finished clockwork. I stared at the floor, the weight of the failure pressing down on me. The silence that followed the clatter was heavier than the noise itself. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that felt entirely out of place in the quiet workshop. I looked at the floor, seeing the glint of scattered screws in the dim light, and a surge of heat flared behind my eyes. My hands curled into fists. The workbench felt like a cage, a wooden barrier between me and the relief of simply walking away. I felt a violent, sudden urge to shove the table, to send the half-built chronometer and the remaining tools crashing into the wall. My muscles coiled, ready to push, my shoulders hunched forward with the weight of that destructive impulse. I leaned my full weight against the edge of the wood, my knuckles white, the grain of the table biting into my palms. I could feel the wood vibrate under my grip. I stood there, trembling, the desire to clear the table and end the grueling work clawing at my resolve. I forced my jaw to unclench. I forced my fingers to uncurl, one by one, until my hands lay flat and trembling on the surface. I did not push. I did not move. I held my position, fighting the rising tide of anger until it began to recede, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the mess I had to fix. I remained motionless, my chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged bursts. The workshop was still, the only sound the faint, distant hum of the forest outside. I needed a point of reference, something that did not shift or scatter. I turned my head slowly toward the lantern. The golden light pooled on the workbench, casting long, steady shadows that did not flicker. I watched the flame within the glass, observing the way it held its shape against the darkness of the room. It was constant. It was unwavering. I stared into that glow, letting the warmth of the light wash over my vision, pulling my focus away from the scattered screws on the floor. I breathed in, deep and slow, drawing the stillness of the lantern into my lungs. My pulse began to match the steady rhythm of the flame. I blinked, the sharp edges of my frustration softening under the influence of the light. I turned my gaze back to the clockwork. The brass gears sat waiting, silent and still. I reached out, my hands steady now, and touched the cold metal of the main housing. I was ready to begin again, anchored by the light that burned bright and true. The work had drained the suppleness from my limbs. I realized then that my shoulders were hunched toward my ears, a defensive posture that made every movement jerky and prone to error. Master Cogsworth noticed the tension before I did. He stepped closer, his movements fluid and unhurried. He placed a paw on my shoulder, pressing down firmly, to force the muscles to release their rigid grip. I felt the ache radiate down my spine as I straightened up, correcting the slump that had crept in over the last hour. Fatigue was the enemy of the chronometer, a silent thief that stole the steadiness from my fingers. We stood back from the workbench, creating a deliberate distance. Between ourselves and the intricate brass components, I rolled my neck, feeling the stiffness crack, and shook out my arms. until the tremors in my forearms subsided. We stood side by side, feet planted firmly on the floor, aligning our centers of gravity. We leaned back over the workbench, the lantern light illuminating the intricate landscape of brass. I reached for the stubborn cog that had resisted us moments before. My fingers hovered over the housing, feeling the slight vibration of the metal. I lowered the gear into place, but it caught on a microscopic burr and tilted, refusing to seat. I felt the familiar heat of irritation rising in my chest, a sharp spike of impatience that threatened to ruin the alignment. I did not pull away. Instead, I let my hand rest flat against the table, feeling the solid wood beneath my palms. I inhaled, counting to 4, and felt the tension drain from my fingertips. Master Cogsworth watched, his own breathing matching mine, a silent anchor in the quiet room. I exhaled, exhaling the frustration until my mind was as clear as the glass lens before me. I picked up the gear again, my movements deliberate and slow. I guided it into the housing, feeling for the exact point of resistance. I applied a gentle, constant pressure. The gear slipped into the groove. It sat flush. A soft, metallic click echoed through the workshop, signaling that the connection was secure. We did not rush to the next piece. We took a moment to verify the fit, ensuring the teeth were perfectly meshed. The rhythm of our breathing held the chaos at bay. The hours began to lose their definition, bleeding into one another like ink in water. We moved in a cycle of constant, minute adjustments. I stopped tracking the passage of time by the lantern light and started measuring it by the accumulation of brass on the workbench. The workshop grew quiet, the frantic energy of the early evening replaced by a steady, humming focus. Every movement became an extension of the clockwork itself. I reached for a screw, placed it, and tightened it without needing to look, my fingers guided by the memory of the metal. Master Cogsworth was a shadow beside me, his presence defined only by the occasional scrape of a file or the soft clink of a gear being set. The world outside the walls ceased to exist. There was only the table, the light, and the growing complexity of the mechanism beneath our paws. We worked through the exhaustion, our movements becoming more economical, more precise. I watched the golden light dim as the oil in the lantern burned low. We were deep in the rhythm now, a trance of brass and shadow. We were no longer building a tool. We were becoming part of the machine's slow, inevitable awakening. The silence in the workshop deepened, pressing against the walls until the room felt entirely detached from the forest outside. Every sound became magnified. The soft scrape of a metal tool against the workbench sounded like a thunderclap in the stillness. I paused, my paw hovering over a small brass gear, and listened. The only thing left in the world was the rhythmic, uneven ticking of the unfinished clock. It was a heavy, persistent pulse that seemed to dictate the speed of my own heartbeat. Master Cogsworth remained motionless, his silhouette carved from the dimming lantern light. He did not speak. He did not move. The ticking grew louder, filling the void where conversation used to be. It was a demanding sound, a reminder of the work that remained undone. I felt the weight of that sound in my chest, a steady thrumming that made the air feel thick and charged. I shifted my weight, the floorboards beneath my feet emitting a sharp, dry creak that echoed into the rafters. We were alone in this pocket of time, trapped in the sound of our own creation. The ticking was no longer just a mechanical byproduct. It was the dominant force in the room, pulling our attention toward the center of the workbench. We waited, suspended in the silence, listening to the clock struggle to find its own steady cadence. The focus shifted. We turned away from the main gear train and directed our attention to the center of the workbench, where the escapement wheel lay waiting. It was the smallest, most intricate component we had yet to install. Master Cogsworth cleared the space, his movements slow and deliberate, pushing aside the stray filings and debris that could jam the mechanism. I leaned in, my breath hitching as I realized the scale of the task. The escapement wheel was a web of brass, thin as a leaf and sharp as a needle. One tremor, one miscalculation, and the entire structure would fail. The lantern light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the table that made the wheel appear to pulse in the gloom. I braced my elbows against the edge of the wood. Master Cogsworth reached for his finest tweezers, the metal tips catching the dim light like twin stars. He did not look at me. He did not look at the door. His entire world narrowed to the tiny teeth of the wheel and the pivot point where it had to rest. I mirrored his posture, locking my muscles, turning my body into a statue. The air in the workshop grew thin, cold, and utterly still. We were no longer building, we were performing surgery on time itself. The escapement wheel sat before us, a silent, golden challenge. I reached for the heavy brass-rimmed magnifying glass and brought it into position. It was heavier than it looked, a solid weight that pulled at my wrist. I held it suspended over the escapement wheel, my eyes locked onto the tiny pivot point through the curved lens. The world outside the glass vanished, leaving only the magnified, distorted landscape of brass teeth and microscopic oil grooves. My eyes began to ache from the intense, unblinking concentration. A dull throb started behind my temples, pulsing in time with the distant, irregular ticking. I felt the muscles in my forearm begin to quiver, a slow, rhythmic twitch that threatened to ruin our alignment. I gripped the handle tighter, my knuckles turning white. The image through the glass wavered, the brass teeth swimming in and out of focus as my vision strained against the dim light. I held my breath. Every fiber of my being was directed toward that singular, stationary point. I was a pillar of stone, frozen in the amber glow of the lantern. I did not blink. I did not sway. I simply held the glass, waiting for the signal to proceed. Master Cogsworth moved with the grace of a shadow. He reached for the needle-thin oiler, his movements stripped of all unnecessary motion. He dipped the tip into the reservoir, withdrawing a single, microscopic droplet of lubricant. It clung to the steel point, a tiny, translucent sphere reflecting the golden lantern light. He brought the tool toward the escapement wheel, moving with such agonizing slowness that the motion was almost imperceptible. I watched the droplet. It trembled, caught by the slight vibration of the floorboards, and for a heartbeat, it seemed ready to slide off and ruin the delicate balance of the brass teeth. Master Cogsworth paused, his hand hovering inches from the pivot. He adjusted his grip, his fingers tightening just enough to stabilize the tool. The air in the workshop felt heavy, pressing against us as we navigated the final, critical gap. He lowered the needle, guiding the droplet toward the exact center of the escapement pivot. One drop too many would gum the gears. One drop too few would cause friction that would grind the metal to dust. He held the oiler steady, the tip now mere microns away from the contact point. I felt the heat of the lantern on my skin, the silence of the room amplifying the sound of our synchronized shallow breathing. He prepared to release the oil, the weight of the entire project resting on that single, shimmering bead. The needle tip touched the pivot. Master Cogsworth did not press. He waited for the metal to draw the oil in by capillary action alone. I stopped breathing entirely. The air in the workshop grew thick, pressing against my lungs like a physical weight. I felt the pulse in my own fingertips, a rhythmic thrumming that threatened to shake the magnifying glass. I squeezed my eyes shut for a microsecond, then forced them wide, staring into the heart of the brass assembly. The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum, pulling the sound out of the room until the only thing left was the internal roar of my own blood. I could feel the tension radiating from Master Cogsworth, his body a statue of perfect, rigid control. We were caught in the gap between stillness and motion. My chest burned, the need for oxygen screaming in my throat, but I did not inhale. I could not risk the slightest tremor. The oiler remained locked in place, the droplet bridging the gap between steel and brass. The pressure of the silence reached its breaking point. The oiler withdrew. The droplet vanished into the pivot, drawn deep into the heart of the assembly. Master Cogsworth pulled his hand back, his movements sharp and efficient. I leaned in, my magnifying glass hovering over the primary gear. For a second, nothing happened. The brass remained frozen, locked in the same stillness that had defined our night. Then, the mainspring released its tension. The first gear jerked forward, teeth grinding against teeth with a harsh, metallic protest. My stomach tightened. I thought the alignment had failed, that the friction would stop the rotation entirely. The gear shuddered, stalled, and then slipped forward again. This time the sound changed. The grinding softened into a smooth, sliding friction. The second gear caught the motion, then the third, and the fourth. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the workbench. The gears were no longer fighting. They were working in perfect, synchronized harmony. The hum grew, a steady and vibrant sound. The hum escalated, transforming from a low vibration into a distinct, percussive pulse. It was the heartbeat of the brass. Each tick resonated against the wood of the workbench, sending ripples through the tools scattered across the surface. Suddenly, the rhythm faltered. A sharp, metallic clack echoed as the escapement wheel surged too quickly, threatening to break the cycle. I lunged forward, pressing my palm against the side of the housing to dampen the excess kinetic energy. Master Cogsworth mirrored my action, his hands steadying the frame as the brass frame warmed under our touch. We held it there, feeling the internal force of the springs pushing against our skin. The mechanism fought back for a heartbeat, then yielded. The erratic clacking smoothed into a deep, resonant thrum. It was a living sound, steady and powerful, echoing the precision we had spent hours crafting. Every gear turned with fluid grace, teeth interlocking in a perfect, repeating dance. The workshop no longer felt like a place of labor. It was a chamber of rhythmic life. The workshop pulsed with the rhythmic thrum of the gears, yet the cycle remained incomplete. Master Cogsworth turned his gaze from the spinning assembly toward the velvet-lined tray on the far side of the bench. There, resting in a nest of silk, lay the balance wheel. It was the final, crowning component of our long night of labor. I shifted my weight, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the kinetic energy of the turning brass. Master Cogsworth gestured toward the tray, his paw steady. I stepped forward, my breath hitching in my throat. The balance wheel caught the golden lantern light, its polished edges gleaming like a captured star. I reached out, my fingers hovering inches from the delicate assembly. The weight of the moment pressed down on us. One slip now would undo the hours of painstaking alignment. I paused, letting my heartbeat slow to match the steady cadence of the machine. I braced my arms against the workbench, locking my joints to ensure absolute stillness. My fingers closed around the cool metal of the balance wheel. I held the balance wheel suspended above the central pivot. The air between my paws felt dense, electrified by the proximity of the spinning gears. Master Cogsworth did not blink, his gaze fixed on the exact point of contact. Suddenly, a heavy thud from the forest floor outside vibrated through the foundation. The workbench shuddered. I froze, my muscles locking to keep the wheel from tilting. The tremor passed, leaving behind a ringing silence. I exhaled, a slow, controlled release of breath that steadied my grip. I lowered the wheel, feeling the magnetic pull of the housing. The metal surfaces met with a microscopic click. I applied pressure, rotating the wheel a fraction of a millimeter until the teeth found their home. It slid into the slot with a seamless, satisfying resistance. I withdrew my paws, leaving the wheel to find its own equilibrium. For a split second, it hung motionless, suspended in the heart of the machine. Then, the tension of the mainspring surged through the assembly. The wheel began to oscillate, a tiny, golden blur of motion. The circuit was closed, the energy flowed, and the clock finally began to breathe. The oscillation of the balance wheel was initially erratic, a jagged pulse that threatened to stall. I watched, my breath held, as the golden metal swung wide, then clipped the side of the housing. A sharp, grating sound cut through the room. Master Cogsworth reached out, not to touch the wheel, but to press his palm against the wooden frame of the clock. He felt the vibration, his eyes narrowing as he sensed the misalignment. I understood instantly. I reached for the fine-tuning screw, my fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. I turned it a fraction of a degree to the left. The grating ceased. The wheel swung back, wider this time, finding the center of its arc. The rhythm smoothed out, shedding its frantic edge. It began to beat with a steady, deep resonance that traveled through the workbench and into the floorboards beneath our feet. The sound was no longer a collection of mechanical parts, but a singular, living heartbeat. The machine had found its soul. The workshop felt transformed by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the chronometer. Every gear, spring, and screw now functioned as part of a singular, living mechanism. I stood back, my hands still slightly trembling from the hours of intense focus, and watched the golden surfaces catch the lantern light. The brass components gleamed, throwing dancing reflections against the walls of the room. The air felt lighter, the heavy pressure of the task replaced by a profound, quiet stillness. I turned my head to look at Master Cogsworth. He was standing perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the rotating escapement wheel. The golden glow of the lantern illuminated his face, highlighting the deep lines of concentration that were now softening into a look of genuine satisfaction. He did not speak immediately. He simply watched the machine, his eyes tracking the perfect, harmonious cadence of the balance wheel. Then, he turned his head toward me. A slow, deliberate movement. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute validation that cut through the remaining tension in my chest. In the reflection of his eyes, the golden light of the lantern seemed to intensify, mirroring the success of our labor. The workshop felt entirely at peace. Master Cogsworth stepped closer, the floorboards creaking softly under his weight. He did not look at the clock anymore. He looked directly at me. The air in the workshop felt thin, charged with the lingering hum of the brass gears. He reached out and placed a single, firm hand against my chest, right over my heart. I felt the rapid, uneven thumping beneath his palm. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that barely rose above the rhythmic ticking of the chronometer. "You think the precision came from the steel?" he said. "You think it came from the magnifying glass or the steady hands?" He shook his head once, a sharp, decisive motion. "The secret tool is not in the box, and it is not in the workbench." He waited, letting the silence stretch between us until I looked down at my own hands, then back at him. "It is this," he whispered, tapping my chest again. "Your own breath. It is the only gear that never fails, the only spring that never snaps under pressure." I watched him, the weight of his words settling into the quiet room. He pulled his hand back, leaving a lingering warmth on my chest. I inhaled, slow and deep. I turned my attention back to the workbench. The grand forest chronometer sat in the center of the lantern light, no longer just a collection of parts, but a unified whole. I leaned in, my eyes tracing the lines of the brass casing. It was flawless. Every screw was flush against the surface, every gear aligned with mathematical perfection. The metal caught the golden light and held it, glowing with a deep, rich luster that seemed to pulse in time with the ticking. I reached out, my fingers hovering just inches from the frame, feeling the faint vibration of the internal movement through the air. I touched the side of the housing. The brass was cool and smooth, polished to a mirror finish that reflected my own steady gaze. There were no scratches, no misalignments, no evidence of the earlier struggle. It stood as a testament to the hours of labor and the new rhythm I had found within myself. I moved the lantern slightly to the left, watching how the light danced across the intricate engravings on the balance wheel. It was a masterpiece of order. I stood there, simply watching the light play across the metal, fully aware of the precision that now defined the room. The memory of the earlier hours surfaced, unbidden. I saw the tray of screws tipping, heard the sharp clatter against the floor, and felt the familiar heat of irritation rising in my throat. I stood still, watching the lantern light flicker against the workshop wall. I closed my eyes and allowed that image of failure to play out in my mind one last time. Then, I exhaled. The tension that had tightened my shoulders for hours began to drain away, sinking into the floorboards. I opened my eyes. The frustration was gone, replaced by a quiet, expansive clarity. I looked at the workbench, not as a battlefield of difficult parts, but as a landscape of completed tasks. My hands rested flat against the wood, steady and still. The urge to rush, to force the next step, had vanished. In its place was a profound, unwavering focus that felt as solid as the brass gears themselves. I looked at Master Cogsworth. He was watching the clock, his expression calm, his posture relaxed. I mirrored his stillness. I felt the rhythm of my own breathing sync perfectly with the ticking of the chronometer. The work was done, and the room was filled with a deep, intentional peace. The ticking began to change. It was no longer a series of isolated mechanical clicks, but a singular, flowing song that filled every corner of the workshop. I stood motionless, letting the sound wash over me. It was a rhythmic victory, a steady pulse that defied the chaos of the hours we had spent. Each beat was crisp, deliberate, and perfectly timed. I tilted my head, listening to the cadence. It was unwavering. The sound did not falter, did not skip, and did not hesitate. It was the heartbeat of our success, vibrating through the floorboards. I looked at the chronometer, watching the balance wheel swing in a perfect, hypnotic arc. The sound was a testament to every spring we had set. It was a song of order reclaimed from the mess of the morning. I felt the rhythm in my own chest, a steady thrum that matched the machine. The workshop, once a place of tension and dropped screws, had become a sanctuary of sound. The ticking was absolute. It was the sound of a task completed with total precision, a victory song that echoed against the walls, steady and entirely our own. The light in the workshop began to shift. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, rhythmic expansion of the golden lantern glow. With every tick of the chronometer, the light seemed to deepen, casting long, soft shadows that danced against the timber walls in perfect synchronization with the gears. I watched the flame inside the lantern. It flickered, then held, then flared, matching the mechanical pulse of the machine. The entire room started to breathe. The golden radiance washed over the workbench, turning the brass surfaces into mirrors. It felt as though the workshop itself had become a living extension of the clock. Every corner, every tool, and every shadow pulsed with that same steady, golden cadence. I reached out, letting my hand pass through the light, and felt a strange, warm vibration in the air. The boundary between the machine and the room had dissolved. We were no longer just standing in a workshop. We were inside the heartbeat of the chronometer. Everything was illuminated, everything was synchronized, and the golden pulse became the only reality left in the world. The weight that had pressed against my shoulders for hours simply evaporated. I looked at the chronometer, its brass surfaces gleaming under the lantern, and the impossible suddenly felt real. We had done it. The gears were locked, the springs were tensioned, and the mechanism was alive. I let my hands drop to my sides, the muscles finally unclenching. A long, slow breath escaped me, carrying away the last remnants of the morning's frustration. I watched Master Cogsworth, his steady gaze fixed on the work, and felt a profound sense of alignment. The constant need for precision had been replaced by a quiet, steady focus. I reached out and touched the edge of the workbench, feeling the faint, rhythmic vibration of the clock through the wood. It was a physical anchor, a testament to the patience we had forged in the dark. The frantic energy that had once filled my chest was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant stillness. I looked around the workshop, seeing the tools now resting in their proper places, and felt a wave of relief so strong it made my knees weak. The room was quiet, the air was still, and the clock continued its perfect, harmonious cadence. We moved away from the workbench, our footsteps soft on the floorboards. A large, plush pillow sat in the corner, waiting. We curled up together, the fabric yielding under our weight. The ticking of the clock remained the only constant, a steady, rhythmic lullaby. I reached out and pulled my tail around, creating a barrier against the cool night air that seeped through the window frames. Master Cogsworth reached for the lantern, turning the dial until the golden flame shrank to a faint, pulsing ember. The shadows in the workshop deepened, turning the walls into soft, dark shapes. I closed my eyes, focusing entirely on the sound of the chronometer. It was a heartbeat, a pulse that dictated the pace of the room. I felt the tension drain from my limbs, leaving behind a heavy, pleasant fatigue. My breathing slowed, naturally falling into sync with the mechanical rhythm. In, out, in, out. The forest outside was completely still. There was no more work to do. Only the steady, harmonious cadence of the clock remained. I let the rhythm pull me under, drifting into a deep, dreamless rest. The rhythm of the clock became the rhythm of my own heart. Every tick was a pulse, every tock a breath, anchoring me to the floorboards of the workshop. I felt the weight of the day dissolve into the soft fibers of the pillow. The air in the room was cool, but the space between us remained warm. I did not move. I did not need to. The work was finished, the mechanism was perfect, and the time we had built was secure. Outside, the trees stood motionless, their branches held in the same steady pulse that governed our rest. I felt the last of the day's tension leave my shoulders, my muscles going slack against the floor. There was no urgency, no ticking that demanded attention. I was patient, I was safe. I was ready for the long, quiet hours of the night. The lantern light had vanished entirely. I let my thoughts drift, unmoored from the gears and springs, floating on the steady, rhythmic sound of the chronometer. Everything was exactly where it needed to be. The forest was still. The workshop was silent. Time was held in perfect balance, and I finally let go. Sinking into the deep, restorative dark, the ticking of the chronometer began to fade. Not because the mechanism slowed, but because my mind ceased to track it. The sound became part of the room, as natural as the grain of the wood or the stillness of the air. I remained motionless, my eyes closed, feeling the weight of the floor beneath us. The forest beyond the walls was a vast, dark expanse, yet it felt small and contained within the steady pulse of our work. There was no sound from the trees, no rustle of leaves, no movement in the brush. The night had reached its peak of silence. I felt the last vibration of the gears settle into the foundation of the workshop. Everything we had built, every spring we had tensioned, now rested in perfect harmony. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the air leave my lungs in a controlled stream. My paws were still. My mind was empty of gears and screws. The world had narrowed down to this single, quiet space. I was fully at rest, waiting for the dawn in a state of absolute, profound peace. The last traces of the lantern light vanished, leaving the workshop in a state of perfect velvet shadow. I remained curled on the pillow, my breathing synchronized with the faint, steady heartbeat of the chronometer. There was no longer a distinction between the ticking of the gears and the quiet pulse of my own life. Everything had slowed to match the rhythm of the machine. Outside, the forest was a vast, dark void, yet it felt entirely contained within the walls of our sanctuary. I felt the cool air of the night pressing against the window, but it could not reach us. We were shielded by the precision we had crafted. My paws were relaxed, the tension of the day completely drained away into the floorboards. I did not need to watch the gears anymore. I closed my eyes, letting the darkness wrap around me like a heavy, soft blanket. The ticking continued, a gentle, rhythmic lullaby. I was patient. I was ready. I was finally at rest, drifting into the deep, silent peace of the night. The rhythm of the clock began to dissolve into the very air of the workshop. I no longer heard the individual clicks of the brass gears. They had become a singular, low hum that vibrated through the floorboards and into my own bones. The lantern had long since cooled, leaving only the faint, silver moonlight to trace the edges of the workbench. I shifted my weight on the pillow, feeling the soft fibers beneath me, and tucked my nose into the warmth of my own tail. The forest outside was a vast, unmoving presence, held in check by the steady pulse we had created. There was no more work to be done, no more springs to set, no more screws to tighten. The time we had secured was now a living, breathing thing that filled every corner of the room. I felt the last remnants of the day fade away, replaced by a profound, heavy stillness. My eyes remained closed, and my breathing slowed. The world had narrowed down to this single, perfect moment of completion. I was anchored, I was safe, and I was entirely at peace. The rhythm of the chronometer finally faded into the stillness of the forest. It did not stop, but it became part of the silence. A pulse so deep it was no longer heard, only felt. I lay on the pillow, my body heavy and still, anchored by the weight of the night. Master Cogsworth remained beside me, a dark, steady shape in the dim room. The brass gears of our work were now just shadows, their purpose fulfilled, their movement eternal. Outside, the trees stood motionless, held in the same quiet balance we had achieved within. There was no more time to measure, only the present moment, vast and unending. I felt the cool air settle against my fur, but it brought no chill, only a sense of profound completion. The room was empty of movement, yet full of the peace we had built. My eyes stayed closed, drifting further into the dark, where the distinction between the workshop and the world outside had completely dissolved. The last of the tension left my limbs, leaving only the steady, slow flow of breath. Everything was in its place. Everything was finished. The final vibrations of the brass gears settled deep into the floorboards, leaving the workshop in a state of profound, undisturbed equilibrium. The rhythmic ticking had become so ingrained in the atmosphere that the silence felt heavy, a tangible weight that pressed gently against the walls. I remained curled on the pillow, my breathing synchronized with the slow, steady pulse of the room. Master Cogsworth was a shadow beside me. The forest outside was no longer a place of mystery, but a sanctuary held in the same perfect cadence we had spent hours crafting. Every gear, every spring, every golden screw was exactly where it needed to be. The work was done, the time was set. I felt the last traces of wakefulness slip away, replaced by a deep, hollow peace that reached into the very roots of the trees. There was no more need to measure the passing seconds. The night had claimed the space, wrapping the workshop in a blanket of absolute, velvet stillness. I let my head rest against the soft fabric, my eyes closed, drifting into the quiet. The world was still. I was finally, completely home. The last faint glow of the lantern flickered once and died, leaving the workshop in total darkness. The mechanical heartbeat of the chronometer continued, but it no longer demanded attention. It had become a natural part of the night, as steady as the wind in the pines. I shifted my weight on the pillow, feeling the soft texture beneath me, and let the final remnants of the day drain away. Master Cogsworth remained motionless, a silent presence in the dark. Outside, the forest was a vast, unmeasured expanse of shadow. The urgency that had driven our hands for hours had evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy calm. I tucked my tail closer, feeling the warmth of the room slowly fade into the cool, crisp air of the woods. There was no more to build, no more to calibrate, and no more to fear. The clock ticked on, a rhythmic anchor in the void. While the world around us held its breath, I let my eyes drift shut, surrendering to the weight of the night. The cycle was complete. The rhythmic pulse of the chronometer slowed in my perception, blending into the very marrow of the workshop. Every tick was a heartbeat, every talk a breath, until the distinction between the machine and the surrounding woods vanished entirely. I felt the floorboards beneath us, solid and unyielding, grounding the quiet. Master Cogsworth remained a steady presence, his breathing long and slow. The air in the workshop grew cool, carrying the scent of pine needles and damp earth from the forest floor. I let my muscles slacken, releasing the last remnants of the day's focus. There was no more to adjust, no more to secure. The ticking continued, a soft, metallic lullaby that pulled the shadows closer. I tucked my tail tight, finding warmth in the stillness. Outside, the trees stood as silent sentinels, watching over the sanctuary we had built. The world had narrowed down to this single, perfect point of rest. Everything was in its place. The cycle was closed, the night was complete, and we were finally, perfectly, at peace. The rhythm of the chronometer has become the rhythm of the woods. I no longer hear the gears as separate sounds. They are the pulse of the earth itself, steady and deep. My breathing has slowed to match this cadence, a long, quiet cycle of intake and release. The workshop is no longer a place of work, but a sanctuary of stillness. Master Cogsworth is a shadow beside me, his presence a constant, weightless anchor in the dark. I feel the cool air of the forest pressing against the walls, yet here, inside, the warmth remains. The tension that once lived in my shoulders has dissolved, leaving only the weight of my own body against the soft floor. The forest outside is a vast, unmoving sea of trees, held in the same balance we have achieved. There is nothing left to calibrate. There is nothing left to wait for. The time we have created is enough. I let the last of my consciousness drift away, carried by the rhythmic ticking that is now indistinguishable from the silence of the night. Everything is still, everything is complete. I am ready for the deep, unbroken quiet that follows the end of the day.